second workshop. I hope the first one was enjoyable. I'll try to be enjoyable too. There's one minor thing, I have to stand between these things. So I'm not ignoring you guys, I just have to stand in between here. Excellent. So what I'm going to be talking about is democratization, or more precisely I'm going to talk about democracy promotion. Because usually in debates, or at some point in debates, you'll get an idea, oh, I need to promote democracy in this and this country because that's going to be fantastic. And then someone else in the debate will say, no, you can't promote democracy because the country is not rich enough and they don't have a middle class, and therefore they won't ever be able to deal with democracy, and therefore it will never be a good idea. And that's kind of boring. Or at least I wrote my thesis on this, and I kind of get frustrated when people do this, and that's the type of analysis you get. So what I'm going to talk about is, firstly, how as an external actor can you actually promote democracy? What are the instances where you have power? Because not always can you influence and get democracy. And then secondly, what are kind of the things that you need in order for a democracy to sort of function, and show you that poor countries actually do have democracy in some cases, and why that's the case and when that happens. And some other stuff as well in between. So just to tell you what I wrote my thesis on the EU democracy promotion in North Africa, Tunisia, Algeria and Morocco. So most of my examples will come from that just because I know it better. And they're kind of current examples as well, so they're probably kind of useful. But there are lots of other regions where this is relevant. And as soon as you have a question, just ask it, because it's, if you sit with the question and have to wait, that's kind of boring. So just raise your hand whenever you have a question. Sure.
Are you going to be talking about the moral question of should we promote?
No. No. Well, if you have 1.5 hours, I suppose you could do that, but I don't really care. But yeah, probably most people don't even dare to argue against the morals of democracy. Anyway, they can argue against the practicalities of having a democracy in a country that isn't ready for it. But when you try to challenge people, they don't. There's lots of people who are like, yeah, democracy is fantastic, always, ever. Even in a country like Sudan, which doesn't really have a country, we need to have democracy.
But the thing is probably also not about the morality of the democracy and if it's good or bad, and if it's good or bad promotion in general. I mean, kind of intervening within the...
Yeah. Again, if we get to it, I can do it in the end if you want to, but I think those are the debates that everyone has done, because you've done intervention debates. And then democracy or democratization is just one type of intervention and not a very dramatic one. So it's less intervention than, say, invading. So therefore, it should be less of an issue, sort of. But I'll get to it because I'll talk a bit about covert action versus action that is agreed to by the country. So I'll get to that in a bit. So firstly, the idea of when can country, or when does it happen, or when are countries ready for democratization? Because there's basically 4 types, I think, of democratization. One is when there's an invasion or a war and someone imposes democratization. It doesn't happen very often. I think Germany and Japan are some really a few examples that were successful and actually happened. Iraq happened, but that's about it. But mostly it's either because elites, like the ruling elites, dictators, actually decide, we think democracy is kind of cool, and will impose democracy. And they do that either because they think they can actually stick to power. So for example, in a number of European countries moved on to democracy at some point after the fall of the wall. In some cases it went very rapidly. One of those cases was Hungary. And part of the reason was that the communists in Hungary thought, we can probably hold on to power better if we actually give over power, do elections now and do it rapidly, because then there's no other organization that can compete with us. The same happened to a certain degree in Russia, and it happened in certain other countries. Like, you just sort of leave the power in the hands of people who already had the power before, because you do it very rapidly. Secondly, there's sometimes the ruling regime actually believes democracy is better for some reason whatsoever. But usually what happens is that the ruling regime realizes, okay, there's too many people who want democracy. there's no way we can hold on to power. We just have to give up and get away. So there's either a collapse of the regime through a civil war, or they just step down because they don't see a way to actually maintain their power. So in Tunisia, the ruling regime or the dictator left because they felt, okay, we have to leave. In Libya it took a little bit longer. Syria, we don't know. That's sort of the process we get to then. Now there's a couple of things that influence the elites, and this is the thing that you need to do when you're an external actor. You need to look at how can I influence the calculus that the ruling regime has. So first of all, you can deal with what they believe about democracy and about their own legitimacy. So for example, if they constantly portray themselves as a very powerful ruling elite that cares about their people, but then they suddenly have to start using violence to actually keep their power, they won't see themselves, or they can't portray themselves as a beneficial regime to the people in the country, and therefore they lose legitimacy, and they lose their own belief in their own legitimacy, sort of, the ruling elites. In some cases that works. If you have a reasonable dictator and you start going against them. I think this is what happened in South Korea. This is probably what would happen in Singapore if people started demanding actual, real democracy. Because the Singaporean leaders would be like, yeah, you're probably right. We don't really want to use violence against you. So therefore we'll go over to the other side. So there's the belief in their own legitimacy, and there's the belief in the legitimacy of violence here that you can influence in the regime. But then secondly, there is the capacity of the regime to actually repress. If they have lots of power, if they have a big military, they're probably much better able to impose their views. China probably is much better able to impose their views than certain other countries. Even though actually I think the military might be the biggest in the world, but compared to their population it's still not very big, I suppose. But yeah, they have enough. North Korea, another example, good, strong military. But it's not just the military, or it's also other things. Like, for example, in Tunisia and Egypt, other North African countries as well, a lot of the power came from the fact that the state was the main benefactor of most people. So most people either worked for the state, they got state pensions, state benefits, or they got, the state kept the prices low, and therefore people could actually remain in good living conditions. So as long as the state has the power to do that, actually has the economic power to control you in that way, you're also fine with state. So basically what people sometimes said is that people in North Africa signed a contract with their state saying, okay, I'm okay with losing all of my democratic rights and some of my other human rights as long as you give me enough to live off, and probably growing wealth as well. This usually works a lot better if you have oil or gas or phosphates in the case of Morocco. Some other things maybe. Yeah, I can't think of another thing, but there are other stuff, I think. And related to that is the idea of rents. So oil and that sort of stuff gives you rents, which means that you don't have to tax your people. So if taxes are low, there's no way for the people to actually rise up against you or have civil disobedience by just not paying their taxes. So you're not dependent on the people in any way, and therefore you can do whatever you want with money. Now, one form of rents, which is a very important one for external actors, is development aid. Because, for example, Egypt they have tourism, but they don't really have anything else that is beneficial to their economy. And most of the other money they got was from, say, America giving them lots of money for their military or for other support. And that is why they were less dependent on their people than other regimes were in the region, like, say, Jordan, which has to listen to their people much better. And then lastly, and this is something that also the regime can influence, but the external actor is a little bit more difficult to influence, is the opposition, like the unity of the opposition. And this is something that you can see it clearly in Egypt, where the Copts and the Muslim Brotherhood and certain other groups were finally cooperating, and that's what brought down the regime. That's also what kept the regime in place for such a long time, particularly in, say, Tunisia. I don't know too much about Egypt here, but Tunisia, where there's like a because it was a French territory, there's a very secular, modernized, westernized group of people who are usually educated, usually speak fluent French, etc., etc. And then there's a more traditional, more religious people. They didn't trust each other. Like the religious people were like, they're all communists, they're all scary, they're all Westerners. And the secular people did not trust the religious people to not bring Syria immediately. So therefore they never cooperated. And therefore the regime stayed in place for 40 or 50 years after they would have wanted to bring it down. So one thing that you need is the unity of people to act against the regime. This is also why in Morocco, no democratization ever took place, or has not taken place yet. Because basically there's, first of all, three groups there. There's the Arabs and the Tamazight, or Berbers. And they definitely don't trust each other. And then overlapping with that is the secular versus religious divide. And since they have a king, but also a parliament, and there's no clear, like the king is not clearly the leader. There's always a prime minister who takes the political responsibility for decisions. Unlike in Tunisia, where basically all of the legitimacy was in the military leader or the president. So the king, what the king does is say, okay, now you rule. Now you are the government, and that could be anything. And then now you are the ruler. And they always sort of have to fight against each other. So now there's a moderate religious party that is in the government, but now there's the seculars. And therefore they keep on fighting with each other, and they never trust each other, because they always think that, no, the king is now supporting you, and I don't trust you anyway. So the big thing about Tunisia then and Egypt was that they bridged the divide that people thought that would never be bridged, and that's what then brought down the regime. Similarly, in Latin America, the same thing happened with Roman Catholics and communists in the 80s and the early 90s, where as soon as these two groups started trusting each other, they were able to bring down dictators there, which was impossible before that, because they needed each other to actually bring down the other group. Any questions so far?
Right. Like one of the things that mostly come up when in debate about democratization is like the importance of like democratic values in order for them to be a democracy. Like, well, we can't let them be a democracy because they will like pick someone that would kill all the homosexuals. Something. Right?
Well, they do that every now and then. So yeah, it's kind of unfair. But so I did not mean that. So you're right. But there's a certain thing, like if they do the Pew, which is some American research institute, has been doing opinion polls in all of the Middle East, and they found out that most people actually do support democracy, and not just the basic idea of democracy is cool because it brings us riches, which is what we often thought they thought, because democracy has been linked to welfare as well as to more freedom. But they actually do support the deeper values of, I accept that sometimes someone rules me or rules over me who is not, doesn't support what I support, etc. So they do have the democratic values are present in the population, but in order to develop the democratic values in the parliament and in government, you need to actually be a democracy. And it doesn't work before you've actually tried it. Because there's the thing about parties cooperating and that sort of stuff, and compromises, and once I lose elections, I actually give up power and that sort of stuff. But you can that only happens once you try it, and that's a point where, as an international actor, you can help, you can give them support, you can link them to political parties in other countries. But it's something that needs to grow. It's something that's never present, or rarely present, before you become a democracy.
Regarding, you said the opposition needs to be coherent, meaning they need to be okay with each other. Can you force that? Can you get that as an international actor to happen? Or do you need to start the democracy right away and then it'll breed from that?
You need to force it. Well, you can't force it.
What comes first?
There needs to be trust in order to overthrow the government. And there's never going to be democracy without overthrowing the government. or the
Yeah, but
current
as an
government.
international actor,
Yeah.
what are you doing in this case? Meaning mechanisms. Why?
I'll get to the mechanisms later, but it's kind of hard. But there are ways to do it, or at least there are ways to what. Okay, I'll get to some of it now. So one of the things you should not do is increase the gap. I'll get to how you can decrease the gap and increase trust later. But one of the things, for example, that the EU has done in North Africa, which was very problematic, is just not support any religious group. So they would support the secular groups in society, political parties, etc. But they would never ever support anything that had any religious taint on it. And if human rights activists were locked up, they would protest with the government. If a religious leader who was not inciting violence or anything, but was asking for more influence, for example, was locked up, they would not do anything. They would. So it was more the silence and the not doing something that gave them the feeling, okay, we're not wanted, we're not trusted by the EU. Gave the secular groups the feeling, okay, we don't need to trust them, or we should not trust them, because our trusted partner doesn't trust them. So you should definitely not increase the not very clever if you want to create unity. And how to force it very quickly? Just force them to cooperate. Say, I'm only going to give you money if you have this and this type of partner as well in the project. Therefore, they start working together. Therefore, they'll find out that they share some values.
Are there places where that work?
I don't know, because it didn't happen in the three countries I researched. But I think it's the only thing you can do. I think what we have seen in the case of the communists and Catholic Church in Latin America was that they found each other. But they found each other through cooperating in small villages where they provided the welfare for people. So if you find common projects that are depoliticized, it can work. I don't know whether it works to force people, but it's the only thing, we haven't tried it yet. So yeah, I don't know for sure. So having said that, let's see. I'm now going to talk about all the ways in which an external actor can influence, first of all, the elites, and then I'll go to the population/opposition. So one thing you can do, which has actually worked in the case of, which you can argue has worked in the case of North Africa, is you can try to influence the beliefs of the elites. Because one of the things about the elites is, or the ruling regime, I call them elites because it's kind of Marxist and it sounds cool. Ruling regime is probably a more proper way to say it. It's not a unity. Like, there's always a dictator, but there's also the military, there's business elites, there's leaders of religious groups or whatever other leaders there are. And as long as all of the people in the regime benefit from the regime, they'll probably support it. But you can try to influence the slightly less influential parts in the ruling regime to change their beliefs, or you can try to change the beliefs of the top ruling elites as well. And there's two ways that you can do that. First of all, you just present sort of the alternative. You show, this is how we do it. It works. We're fine. We don't have revolutions. We don't have whatever. And we're kind of prosperous. So you show all the benefits of democracy. Then probably you get a sort of empty statement, we support democracy. This is what has happened in lots of North African countries and the Middle East. They say, in general, we think democracy is probably good. They signed that kind of treaty. They signed it, for example, when they signed the Mediterranean Union Treaty with the EU and all of the Mediterranean countries. They signed sort of the idea that, sign up to the idea that in principle we think democracy is good. And then what you do is you start pointing out, okay, so you're not keeping yourself to your own promises. You said you were going to increase democracy, you're not. You said you were going to increase press freedom, you're not, etc., etc. So what you then do is you show the alternative, you show why it's good, and it usually attracts some parts of the elite. Probably the parts of the elite that welcome. I'll just stop.
Sorry.
No problem. So I'm somewhere halfway into mechanisms for democracy promotion. I hope you'll catch up. So the elites, in some way, some parts of the elites, probably the elite part that have more contact with the outside world, are more inclined to actually be look at it as a beneficial thing, or at least see things like stability in government, which you can assume or can at least portray as something good, or more acceptance internationally, which is also something you can portray as something good. And they'll see that this is a good thing that they should probably get. Then if you start saying to countries, okay, you're not doing what you promised us to do, that can actually create a vibe or like an idea that countries need to actually change their behavior. It sounds kind of silly, particularly in a debate scene where you always have to have hard measures to actually get results. But one of the things that does work is if a larger power says, you are not sticking to the agreements we've made. And as long as that larger power has some form of influence over the smaller country, it actually does make them change their behavior. So the EU, which is the biggest trading partner for all of North Africa, and also is the biggest aid giver together with the US, but the EU is way bigger than the US in this sense, in these areas. It actually does have an influence if they say, okay, we don't think you're doing this very well, and you need to change. And the reason, one of the reasons why it works is actually that they also compete with each other. So it's a very public system where one country says, okay, you're not sticking to the rules, and Morocco is doing way better. And then Tunisia feels, okay, I need to change my game and also get this thing going. And therefore, maybe Algeria is also going to think, okay, I'll change my behavior just a tiny bit as well. And it's silly, but it works. And
Have you noticed that they act like little children?
Yes. And I haven't figured out why. But I think it's partly because they get international recognition because they follow the rules, sort of. And it's rules that they have accepted as the rules that they should be following. And because they are not necessarily always legitimate internally, because they aren't democratic, and their government or their citizens do want democracy, and then if they're also, for example, not performing economically, then they need to have some form of legitimacy. So if they can say, look, the EU likes us, they think we're doing very well, that gives them more legitimacy and therefore a way to convince their population that they're doing well and that they shouldn't be opposing them. And it has been said that this is the reason why Morocco hasn't democratized, because both the EU and the US, right after the Tunisian uprising, there was a change in Morocco. They changed the constitution a tiny bit, gave a tiny bit more power and democracy to the people. And then the EU and the US both said, oh, that's fantastic, Morocco, just go on, this is great. They probably meant continue and do more, but this is where Morocco stopped. Because they got the praise, and therefore they said, look, people, we don't really need to change. So it's a way for them to claim legitimacy. Now, so what just 1 second, and then, so what an external actor should be doing is discrediting the government when they're not doing like the democracy promotion that they promised. And you can do that overtly or covertly. But I'll get to that in a bit.
Is Morocco still a monarchy?
Yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah, you can be a democratic and a monarchy. I'm from a country that's like that. I think there are more people here who are from countries like that. But yeah, they don't really have a parliament with power. If you do it covertly, though, there's not really a way. Like, I don't really see how you can do this. Like, you can't walk around in a country, send spies in, and say, "Look, your government's really, really bad." That's just going to look silly. What you could do is do it more overtly, but then probably you discredit yourself. If you are going to send out balloons and throw down leaflets saying your government's really bad, I'm just making things up.
Isn't that what just happened in Belarus? And actually that's created massive international pressure for us to do something.
Mm-hmm.
So wouldn't that be a positive rather than a negative?
It is a positive. But we don't do it by directly aiming for citizens, right? We go for the government, and we go for organizations maybe, but we don't go for the citizens on the streets. We hope to reach them, but we can't really. But there is one way that we do like we put the international pressure on. That was more what I meant earlier. But if you do covert actions, I think the one thing you could do is actually, it's not really covert, it's very overt, but you force them to actually have more press freedom, for example, or more, particularly more internet freedom, so they get international sources on their own government, and therefore learn that probably what the government said is not quite true. And that the big victories that they had in, say, the Western Sahara are actually just terrorizing a few minor people in some tiny village, and that sort of stuff. Whereby they learn that their government is kind of sin, hopefully. Or at least that they learn that there are other options or other opinions about this. So you bring down the legitimacy of the government and discredit them by bringing something else. Say, internet access to people who didn't have it before. So the legitimacy of the regime comes from this international recognition. It can also come from people recognizing that this is the proper regime. Like in China, where lots of people do believe that the regime brings stability. And because it brings stability, it brings more economic prowess, therefore it is legitimate, and there's some nationalism involved as well. On the other hand, in say Egypt or Tunisia or Morocco, it was very much based on the idea that we take care of you. So we provide you welfare. We provide you protection against the West or the colonizers or those nasty people in this country, or whatever else they could think of. What then happened, or what could happen, is when the economy doesn't function, or when you take away development aid, or when you put a boycott on a country, all things we don't necessarily do very frequently. But when their economic performance goes down rapidly, they also lose legitimacy fairly rapidly. This is what brought the Algerian crisis on in the 1990s, because the government basically felt, okay, we're really not doing very well, even though we have gas income, and lots of gas income. We're losing out money. We need to raise prices or bring up prices. And okay, what can we do to solve this? Oh, let's democratize just a tiny bit. Let's give the people a little bit more power so we seem more legitimate. And then obviously the feast, the Islamic Federation thing, won the elections and the military intervened, and then we got civil war for 10 years, which probably wasn't the best of ideas. But so if they lose economic legitimacy very frequently, regimes also lose other legitimacy. Okay, so then lastly, there's also the idea of resources that the regime has, and I've talked about that before. They have military resources, economic resources. They don't have to tax, and they have social welfare. There are ways in which you can influence that. Firstly, and this is very structural, like it's never ever going to get you quick results. So it's never going to work in a debate on the prop side. You can't say, I am going to bring democracy in this particular way. The way is to force governments to privatize, to force governments to take their hands off the economy, and particularly fight corruption and fight any schemes that brings the ruling regime lots of money. Because that's going to take 20, 30 to 40 years. And also, it brings in lots of other questions, like the normal liberal versus social democratic kind of argumentation. So it's not a very good idea to bring in a debate, but in general what has been found is if the government doesn't have much control over the economy, unless it's a very good government, right? Singapore is, again, a nice example of a good government which is not so corrupt as many other regimes, and takes care of their people first and only then themselves. Tunisia for a long time was like that, but slowly became more corrupt. But basically what you want to argue then is say, okay, as soon as you start privatizing and mostly also rationalizing the economy, so it needs to actually be focused on making money instead of creating power for people. and creating influence for people. So you need to open it up to competition much more. That is even more relevant than actual privatization. You need to open it up to competition from other countries, so that only the things that actually make economic sense and make money are going to be things that are still functioning and are still working. But that brings lots of hardship. There's lots of reasons not to do that. Because lots of people are going to then be dependent on social welfare, or going to have to work for very minimum wage, and all sorts of other like political decisions that you don't want to force people through or go through anyway. And you're not going to be able to defend that in 14-minute speeches. So what you can also do, however, in terms of long-term structural things, so this is more a sort of an argument on the upside for if you don't change this, you're not going to change anything if you democratize. Look at Russia, where the oligarchs were former communists, or were powerful in the Communist Party in some ways, and then took over, and they're still in power, basically. Another thing is, one of the things that you need for a democratic culture is enough people who have enough capacity, like the skills to be able to actually be active in a democracy. Which means people need to be able to read, they need to be able to be active in organizations, which means that they need to have organizational skills, they need to be able to link and trust with people that aren't necessarily their family or their clan. And this is one of the issues in, say, Sudan and Somalia. There is no trust between the clan or the family, and therefore there is no political cooperation.
But like, what would they say if they say, well, they might like do bad voting, but as long as they vote, it's a democracy. Like, that's an argument that...
Well, yeah, then it's a democracy for one term. There's actually a definition for a democracy that it needs to have 2 peaceful turnovers of power. And by that I mean that one term the Social Democrats ruled, and then the next term the Liberals, and then the next term the Christian Conservatives, or something like that. Or it could be the Social Democrats again, or whatever. You get the point. So in that sense, a number of countries like Austria and Japan are only now considered democracies because they never had a change in power until the 1990s or the 2000s. Whereas they have been voting. But if they only vote once, and then it's very bad voting, and then you get, say, Putin, who then stays in power for a while and then gives it to another member of his party and then comes back into power again, then it's no longer a democracy at some point, because there is no turnover of power. And slowly but surely all democratic rights might just disappear. Another example could be some African countries where there is a democracy once and then you vote, and then for say 10 or 20 years the same ruler is in power until people get fed up with that ruler and they vote for someone else who is also one ruler and then rules for 10, 20 years. Sorry,
is there a way to like take that out of the mechanism, meaning make sure there's some sort of constitution of sorts?
There's always a good constitution. It doesn't necessarily teach you something. The Russian constitution is perfect. So it's not the constitution ever, or it's what people do with it. So what you could do is argue, and I don't know whether you should do that in the first speech or the second speech, but you need to argue that there are mechanisms or there are people, groups in the country that have an interest in keeping an actual democracy functioning, or a willingness to keep it functioning. And on the other hand, that there are international actors that can make sure and can help this to happen. So if you deal with, say, Turkey, which is a democracy, but it has some problems sometimes, you could for a long time, no longer, argue that there is the European Union, which presents a network or like a structure within which Turkey is embedded, even though it's not a total part of it. And therefore it is never going to turn to a real dictatorship and will always be sort of democratic because it has an interest in being democratic because it wanted to join the EU. We sort of messed that up. So I don't think that's an argument you can use any longer, but there are still other countries that want to join the EU for which that works, which could still make silly decisions, say Serbia, that like they could still go the other way around if something happens that in Kosovo, for example, that like frightens the Serbian nationalists. But then there's the structure of the EU to protect them. Not quite sure if there are other structures in other countries that can do in other continents that can do the same thing.
Could you place yourself there? Meaning, could you say, I will make sure there's a democracy?
You can, if you set, for example, promise strong development aid only if there's real democracy. And I think this is way stronger, if you promise preferential access for trade. Because a lot of these countries are not only not democratic, but they also are relatively dependent on, say, agriculture or first sector goods, so non-produced goods, agriculture or minerals, etc., etc. And they get high tariffs, and if we, as the EU or the US, and the same goes for, I think, Australia and Canada, if we would lower or abolish our tariffs for certain countries, that would bring enormous benefits to them in terms of economics. If North Africa could actually export their olives to the EU for the prices that it should be exporting them for, we would have very cheap olives, which would be great. But more importantly, they would actually be able to develop their economy significantly and be able to feed a lot more people from that. But because Spain and Greece and France also have olives, they're not allowed, basically. And I think that's more interesting because it's more long-term than development aid ever is going to be. So, where was I? Oh yeah. So one of the things that you also need to do is for the population to be ready for democracy. So teaching them how to read and write. Very long-term, very structural thing. So it's not something that you can use in a debate. You can't say, look, we want to democratize a country, therefore we're going to teach them, we're going to give them basic education. There's lots of other reasons why you should do that, but democratization in 50 years is not a reason to do basic education, even though it's something that would help and would probably promote democracy a lot better than invading the country. It's not something you can do in a debate, but it is one of the things that you could argue would help the country. Another thing is to help it develop a communication infrastructure, so newspapers that are independent, like organizations that are independent. What did Putnam call it? Okay, so in Dutch we say the social middle field, which means the field between the state and the people, which is all organizational structures that help you integrate into society. It can be churches, it can be political organizations, human rights advocacy groups, or any kind of organization that is somehow related to society. So a sports club is a little bit less likely to be effective, but could be because it still teaches you skills in organization. But it mostly has to deal with activism within society, any type of volunteerism. So if you help them build up that kind of networks and help them structure them and make them more national, for example, and less local, that would also prepare the country for democracy. And again, that's an off argument. If you think there's a country that doesn't have much social organization, I think Belarus is one of the examples where all of these social organizations, if they exist, are state-oriented or state-dominated in some way, so they're not trusted, and therefore organizations in general might not be trusted very much. And so you need to do something with that. Okay, so one thing the regime has is when you look at the regime power, they have the legitimacy from the economy, etc., etc. Now, one thing you can do to make them lose that legitimacy and do it in a way that is acceptable, well, it's never acceptable, but makes it acceptable to. Should I move to this sponsor for a bit? Okay. So it makes it acceptable for a country to intervene is if you have discredited. So they have signed a treaty to say we're going to become more democratic. What you then need to do as an external actor is to, on the one hand, make it attractive to become democratic, so offer rewards. One of the things the EU could offer to Eastern European countries was membership in the EU, which brings loads of benefits. One of the things we can't offer, for some reason, to North Africa, because we decided they're not very European, is membership. But what we can do, and what we've tried to do, is offer them other things that could become the same thing. So there's the Mediterranean Union, which was supposed to enter into a tariff-free zone in 2010. That obviously never happened. But again, there are ways to create impulses to countries to actually do this. Now, if you tell Moroccan citizens, yeah, see, we promise you free entry, also immigration, easy immigration into the EU, if your government would do this and this and this, and then the government didn't do it, that's a way to discredit the regime and to show your willingness to help them, and their unwillingness to become democratic. This, however, needs to have certain things that the EU, for example, didn't have. One, credibility. Like, if you mess around with Turkey so much, you're not credible to other countries that aren't necessarily European, that you're going to stick to your promises. One of the things we haven't done in the past as the EU is actually reward, like, we would have treaties saying we will reward countries that become more democratic, we will punish countries that do not become democratic or go down with democraticness. And then we didn't do that. Because we thought it would anger people, or we just didn't want to do it, or Spain and France didn't think it was a good idea, but Sweden and Denmark did think it was a good idea, and we just never agreed on it. So nothing happened. That's not very credible, and therefore it's not going to be credible in the future either. And this is actually an interesting moment in history in that respect, because the EU decided to be more creditable, like more credible in their benefiting countries that have become democratic versus countries that got stuck in the old situation. They decided that in 2011. I don't know what's happened with that yet, because I haven't looked into that. But it might be that they actually change their behavior and therefore become more credible. But the same is true for the US. Like, they can say they support democracy, but then they support Egypt, which clearly wasn't a democracy. And they did the same in Latin America as well. Like, supporting Nicaragua, nah, not the democratically elected communists, but they do support the dictator that came after. It just doesn't make it very credible. So you have to watch out and be credible. But also, and this was one thing that was very problematic, not very relevant for debate speeches, but it is, I think it's interesting anyway, is benchmarks. Like, they would say, you should become more democratic. You should have freer press. But then they'd never say specifically what that meant. So, for example, what Morocco did a lot, and which is why they get praised, is they change the law, but they don't change the practice in any way. So they'll say, okay, we've created more freedom, more newspapers are allowed, we've stopped the limiting of freedom of speech in terms of Islam and in terms of the king. So you can be slightly more critical of the king nowadays than you could 10 years ago. But there's so much self-censorship because they know they're going to be harassed. They're not going to be locked up in prison anymore as a journalist, but they're still going to be harassed by the secret police. Doesn't change much. So people are still not going to change their behavior. In practice, nothing's changed. And also, even though, for example, now religious parties are now allowed in Morocco, they're not allowed to register for parliamentary elections. So yeah, you get to exist, but there's no real reason for you to exist. So there's really no change whatsoever.
That's what happened in Turkey.
In what way?
I think it was in Turkey. There's like a military council similar to what's going on in Egypt, and every election they like reorganize and try to run, and the military council would exclude them from the elections, and a few years would go on, and then again and again and again and again.
Yeah, and they reform the party and they get to participate or they do not get to. Well, we have an example from Belgium like that as well, actually. It's completely different, obviously, but it's the Vlaams Blok, which is a right-wing party, which was banned from participating, and therefore they decided to change their name to Vlaams Belang, which is obviously very different, and they had exactly the same leadership. They changed 2 words in their program, and then they were allowed to participate. But the difference is they were allowed to participate. They now have like 1/3 of the vote in many parts in Flanders, which isn't necessarily a good thing. But at least there's a difference there between real democracy and not really a democracy. So if you do that, economic benefits or non-economic benefits in terms of either membership of, say, the EU, membership of a trade agreement or development aid, etc. As long as you're credible, as long as it's a big enough reward to actually be interesting, and as long as it's clear what you need to achieve in order to get the things, it would actually be beneficial and it would work. But you need to argue that it is all these 3 things, where actually the benchmark thing, like it needs to be clear what you achieved, that's sort of a given. Like, if someone's going to complain on the opposition side, you need to show why it's a credible thing and a clear thing. But in most cases, as an opposition, you could use examples how it's been done wrongly in the past, but you can't really use it as a reason why you shouldn't impose this plan. What you can do, however, is always argue this is not going to be enough for the country to change. And if it isn't enough for the country to change, it might actually be discrediting you as an external actor. Because the EU looks kind of silly, constantly saying, we promote democracy, we think it's great, we think we have these benefits for you, and then not doing anything. Not actually sticking to the promises they make, and not actively promoting democracy. And there's lots of reasons for it. Like Algeria and the crisis and the terrorism that caused in France. It was a good reason for the EU to be reluctant to promote democracy in North Africa. But it did make them look kind of like, I make promises and I'm not sticking to them. Don't trust me. So that's how you sort of deal with it on the prop side and the op side. Now then lastly we get to sort of, what can you do for the opposition? How can you help the opposition that's an interesting animal. So firstly you can just support them and train them, because in many cases they don't necessarily have the background or the skills or the material wealth to actually stand up against the government. Because what often happens in dictatorships, at least these type of dictatorships that are sort of not entirely non-democratic and not entirely democratic either, because they're dictatorships, is that there is some form of government support for opposition forces or social organizations. So there will be labor unions that are state supported. There will be doctors' unions, lawyers' unions, journalists' unions that are all supported by the state. So you need to first of all find the real opposition, which is a bit of a problem. Because there is no, depending on the country, there is no real opposition, or they're very limited, and they don't have much support. For example, in Morocco, you would find opposition in either religious organizations that are similar, they have different names, but they're fairly similar to, say, the Muslim Brotherhood or Hamas, and not necessarily in terms of their religious strictness. Like, I don't know enough about that. But definitely in terms of, they provide social welfare for people in poorer backgrounds. They provide legal aid, or they provide schooling for people who don't necessarily get that in any other way. So they provide all those like essential things that the state cannot do anymore, or doesn't do because they're corrupt. So that's one side of the opposition, because they're usually attacked by the state because they're too powerful. And on the other hand, there will be secular organizations like human rights advocates or communists, because there's still a couple of them running around. And, well, sure.
I have a question. Don't you think that this support of the opposition is a kind of tricky thing?
Yep.
Because like that's exactly what turns against the opposition.
Yep. Yeah, no, that was the next thing I was going to say. because that's what's been used very frequently by these states. They said, okay, these organizations are supported by the West, those annoying people in other countries that just claim to be morally superior, but really they're not. This is probably what happens in Russia a lot as well. Look, they're all foreigners, they're foreign supporters, they want to bring down the state. Yes, that's true. It's worked for a long time in Egypt in particular. But it differs a bit. Like, some countries are more open to Westerners. They get lots of tourists. And in those cases, very frequently, they have a more nuanced view of foreigners or Westerners, and then it wouldn't work for the state to claim that all foreigners are bad and they're not gonna, they're all supported and they're all nasty, annoying people. It does work in countries where there's little or no contact with the Western world or with whatever supporter you want. The other thing is, usually if you do it openly, it might actually be better, because then the organization can claim, yeah, that's true, but we also get support here, and we also get support here, and it's fine, and it's all out in the open. If you do it secretly, that might actually be more problematic. On the other hand, in a country like Egypt where that works, you might have to do it secretly, because otherwise you're not allowed to give the support, which is like a choice you need to make. But I think, like, if the choice is either we don't support and there's no opposition, and therefore there's never going to be a democracy or a democratization, or we do support and there's a risk that they're going to be called the fifth column of westernization, then I think we should go for the option of funding, even if there's a risk. But it is something that you can argue on both sides. I don't know the answer. But, so the other thing you need to do, so the two main groups are usually one group that has support among a larger group in society, and a smaller group which doesn't necessarily have much support, but they usually have more resources in other ways, like more capacities or more money, etc., etc. So in the case of, well, actually in the case of Latin America, that's not true, because the Roman Catholic Church had one group of support and lots of skills and resources, and the communists had the other half of the population basically as support, but they probably had much less influence on the higher level of society. So as soon as they started to work together, the communists, which had more arms, could use the Catholic Church, which had the international network, the international support, and the regime influencing. But what you need to do then is get them to cooperate, and I talked about that. I haven't figured out any, during this speech or this talk, any other ways to get them to cooperate, and start locally, start in small projects, or start in depoliticized projects, and get them to work together, demand that they work together, and thereby get them integrated. One other way, though, that you can do this is to, for example, give development aid. Say we're going to build a port in some city where they wanted a port, and make sure that local groups are going to have to be influential in the process. So local democracy, get people to talk about what they want, where they want it, etc., etc. If you do that, you do a couple of things. One, you train people in how democracy works. You get them to realize that the state can actually listen to you and be interested in you and how that works. And also, you get the groups together, the influential groups, and you get them to cooperate on something non-political, etc., etc. So in that way, you do it secretly, but it's not secretly because it's out in the open and everyone knows it's happening. But fourthly, you could say, and this can be secretly or non-secretly, okay, we're going to give you money or whatever else you want as an opposition, but you need to cooperate. You Muslims or Islamists from these and these denominations, you need to cooperate with these secular feminist movements, and you need to sit down and talk to each other. That hasn't been tried yet, so I don't know whether it works. But what you do need to do is make sure that the opposition has legitimacy. As in, you need to make sure that they actually have contact with the people. So what you don't want is that one group of secular feminists in Tunisia, which do have support, but not very much, and make them the new rulers of society, because that's kind of silly. Because they're not going to be supported, they're not going to be trusted by society in general. So you need to make sure that they, or whatever other opposition you choose, or whatever other combination of opposition you choose, have enough access to the rest of the population. And by that, and what you need to do there is, on the one hand, give them the resources and the skills, but more importantly, create that freedom of press that I was talking about, the freedom of internet access, non-censored internet access, and non-censored websites, etc., etc., and TV and radio shows that are slightly less censored. Now, this sounds like something that no government is ever going to do. But what we have seen in Tunisia is that journalists got just a tiny, like a fraction more freedom, and then they took that tiny fraction of more freedom to criticize local policy, I think it was, and they made that into a big thing where they opened up talk shows on government policy, which were focused on non-political policy things like healthcare in certain neighborhoods. But it was possible for people to start talking and discussing government policy for the first time publicly on radio and TV. And that opened up a space for people to learn how to discuss politics and policy. And it has been argued that this is, like some scientists somewhere said that this was that people learned that there is more, like there is actually a democratic way to influence the government, and like there are more people, most importantly, that feel this way, and that we need to connect with each other. Now, this is like all I wanted to talk about. No, go ahead.
My question is just that everything that you're saying I understand, and I see where it applies, but I don't think it applies at all to the oil-rich monarchies in the Gulf. So I'm not sure how you would argue for that. I don't think that the economic incentives, the aid, the encouragement would work at all. They have money. They certainly have legitimacy for people.
It differs a bit actually. I don't know enough about these countries to say this about all, but I know, for example, that Qatar is doing the Singapore thing, where like treating their people very well, aiming at education, and like in general lifting the people up. But in Saudi Arabia, lots of the native Saudi Arabians are actually really rather poor and uneducated, and they're not benefiting from the state in any other way than that they get some food and some oil. And this is what I've been told. Like, I haven't actually read about this, but if you aren't from the ruling like group, whatever clan, then you don't benefit. Okay, that's not true? All right.
No, there's a big social network. Like they all get free education, free welfare. So that's why there's a lot of legitimacy to the ruling powers.
The interesting thing, though, is that they have been democratizing slightly of late. Like they've had municipal elections and stuff like that. And one of the things that you did see was that you didn't necessarily get the results that they wanted in the government. So there is some room there. But I agree, you can't do anything with the economics, and you can't do anything with the with all of the other things about legitimacy, because they believe in it. The only thing you can do is actually spread the idea that democracy is the thing to do, and to make the government realize that most of their people think that is true as well, and then hope that 30 or 40 years later they actually change. It's not something you can debate about, I'm afraid, but it is something that you can do in the end. So the bottom line of everything I have told is that as an external actor you can do a tiny bit. Like you can change some things, some preconditions of democratization, but you can't really do that much. Because this is something that you can see when you look at Tunisia. Like we all think that Tunisia happened because Bouazizi burned himself in a square, and therefore people got angry, and therefore there was a whole revolt that started. But in the year, or in the years before that, one self-immolation, as I heard this new word while I was writing my thesis, there were hundreds of other people who did, well, not hundreds, but definitely about 80 to 100 people who did the same, and no one ever noticed, or there was nothing that made people organize themselves over that one. And there were a couple more later on that no one ever reported either. The conditions that were there in Tunisia had been there for 20 years. The exact same conditions that were there, well, not the exact same, but fairly similar conditions had been there for 20 years before this happened and before they started revolting. And in this particular case, we can say, okay, it was the internet, it was the fact that no official organizations like labor unions or whatever were actually integrated, and it was just young people who then connected to advocacy networks, human rights networks, and to local groups of political parties. And all of the anger sort of boiled up, and it spread through social networks of families getting together for funerals. Now that's a lucky set of circumstances that created one revolution that then created a revolution in a whole area of the world. But it really started with something that had been happening for at least a few years before. And we can't really explain why this happened here and now, and what, if anything, what influenced that. So even if an external actor is like doing all these things I said, or doing other things, you never know what's going to happen and whether it's going to have any influence, unless you actually invade the country and say, okay, from now on you're democratic. Because then at least you're entirely certain that for one election cycle you're going to be democratic, and hopefully for a long time. So, like, there's no way, like, either in the debate world or in the real world, that you can usually sell this policy in any way, because you can never be certain of the results, and it might actually cost a lot of money if you, for example, open up your markets or give development aid. So even though we are actually pretty sure that the things I mentioned work, but we never know whether it's going to be in 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, 100 years. So therefore you might as well not do it and just wait and see whether countries democratize or don't democratize, because there's nothing you can do. So keep that in mind when you're debating or when you're thinking about this in general. You might just not change anything if you're doing this.
So if I unfortunately am first prop and I guess this house would invade something to democratize it,
yeah,
my best chance is to say, look, we give it a shot, otherwise it won't happen.
No, what you would do, like, it depends a lot on the country, but I think what you would first have to do is show, if you do want to do it, well, you have to do it in the nation. First of all, you need to show that the country is actually willing to democratize. Maybe not the ruling elites, but the rest of the people do believe in democracy. Now, you can argue this in general. If we do tests, most countries in the world, most people will say they believe in democracy. I think North Korea might be the exception, but we don't really know what they actually believe. So that's a general thing, but the more specific thing is that you probably need to look for examples, either of countries that are equally unlikely to democratize, and show that in these cases we have seen that the people do believe in democracy and are willing to fight for it. Say Libya, Syria, which 2 years ago we didn't think would ever democratize, and now they're fighting for it, or have been fighting for it. So you can show a willingness. Then the second thing is that you need to show that there are enough of the preconditions that are there for democracy to be able to make it function. Now, the preconditions are, I was going to move through that anyway, so this is fantastic. So what is normally argued for the preconditions is you need to have people who are enough middle class people, you need to have enough, not necessarily enough income, like GDP in a country, but you need to have enough people who are able to devote time and effort and skills into democratic culture, so into organizations, into the societal middle field, as I call it. There is civil society, that's the word. So usually what people argue is you need middle classes for that because they have enough free time and they have enough skills in order to do that. Now in many countries actually that we're talking about, in say Belarus or Morocco or other countries, there is a middle class and it's sizable, but most of them are actually integrated into the state system because they work for the state, they work for semi-state institutions, or they're dependent on the state in some other way. Is that not true? Or because never mind. No, I was just wondering. Because I'm not quite sure about Belarus. I'm just saying that because I think it's probably true.
Because I wasn't sure.
All right. So you don't necessarily need a middle class, and equally, there are countries in the world like Costa Rica, which has basically been democratic for most of its history, which is dead poor. Like India is also dead poor, but we can sort of argue that their democracy, although it's been very long, is a bit I'm not quite sure you can call it malfunctioning. It's just very peculiar. And like, there's so many reasons why India should not be democratic that it's a miracle that it is. But so let's just ignore India for a bit. But Costa Rica is a very poor country with a functioning democracy where enough people are integrated into the political system and believe in the political system and don't get sold or bought by politicians just saying, I'm going to give you a road and therefore you should vote for me, or I'm going to give you a job, therefore you should vote for me. Because that's one of the issues if you have many poor people, besides the fact that they might not have the time or the education, they are also thought of as more easily bought by politicians. This is not necessarily true because the really poor people aren't going to change, nothing's going to change for them anyway, and they're probably still on agricultural subsistence level, so they're not going to be influenced by most of the policies anyway, but still, so one of the things that is actually a lot more important than having a middle class necessarily is not having too much economic differences. The Gini scale, so the amount of difference between the richest and the poorest should not be too big. Because if it is too big, or if there is a tiny group of really rich people and a huge group of poor people, and no middle class in between, or little middle class in between, there usually is no trust between the two groups. The rich are going to assume that they're going to have to give up all of their power and their money, and the poor are going to assume that the rich are going to be corrupt and take over the state and buy their way out of it. So there's no way, there's not enough civil trust between groups in the state that have different types of power to influence the state, and therefore basically what happens is what happens in a lot of Latin American countries. There's either a right-wing dictatorship or there's a left-wing semi-democracy, which takes away the power from the rich until the rich decide, no, now we're taking over again, and it's going to be a right-wing dictatorship for a while again. So there's not enough trust between the two groups, and therefore very frequently you get into this oscillating non-democracy, democracy sort of. So what you do need, however, is enough people with enough skills to be able to be democratic. So enough people who can read, enough people who can interact with other people, enough people who can build up civil society. If you can argue that that's the case, that part is ready, then you need to argue that the country is ready in other ways. And one of the ways is they need to have enough independent media, or they need to be able to build up the independent media fairly quickly, because otherwise you'd get into trouble. I don't know if anyone's read Skinner, From Voting to Violence, but that's what he's been arguing in a lot of countries after colonization. When they got independent, they weren't quite ready for the independence. And one of the things was they didn't have independent media that were unrelated to political parties. So every political party had its own media that was broadcasting their opinion. And what happened was that all of the political parties were based on, say, ethnicity or religion, and were exclusive. So the political parties were like, no, vote for us because you belong to our group. And then because there was also no media that was independent of that, there was no common sort of discourse of people who could talk to each other and thereby find compromises and find enough trust in the society. Now what happened then was that in lots of, I know lots of African countries have this, but if I'm now going to name any African country, I'm pretty sure that's the one country that doesn't have it. But I think this is true for, say, Kenya or the Congo. One group would get into power, and they would give all the benefits to that one group and that one geographic area, until all the other groups decided, okay, we don't like this, now we want the benefits, and then one other leader would get into power and give all the benefits to that one region, or the other region that they were in power for. Oh, Nigeria as well, actually, to a certain extent. So you need to show, on the one hand, that there is an independent media that can sort of check on the political parties, and that can make sure that there is a discourse that is separate from the political interest. And also, you need to make sure that there are organizations that are nationwide. You don't need to argue that there are no distinctions, that there is no different ethnicities, because lots of the countries that you'll be invading have lots of different groups in society that don't necessarily trust each other, that don't necessarily have the same religion, that don't necessarily have the same language, and don't necessarily cooperate much. And here we come to India as an example. More languages in that country than in some parts of the world, and more different ethnicities than in some parts of the world. I think Latin America as a whole is more homogeneous than India as a country, for example. But still, it sort of works, and it works because most of the political parties are not based on ethnicity or religion. Like, some of them are, and some of them aren't. They usually aren't necessarily based on ethnicity, but more religion. Also, the way they shaped the districts originally was to never have majorities or pure majorities in one district. So there would always be cooperation between different groups in each district or voting district or something like that. So you need to make sure that in the political system, it is not based on what they call primordial, like intuitive group thinking, like ethnicity, religion, language. This is why Belgium just doesn't work. It's not really a country anymore, because basically they separated the whole political system on the basis of language. Like, so there's a French socialist and there's a Flemish socialist party, and they're completely separate. They never cooperate, and then they need to form a government, but they're totally separate parties. And then they need to form a government with 3 other parties from the Flemish part and 3 other parties from the French part, and they just never really interact. That's one way to completely destroy all trust between parties, and thereby all forms of cooperation, and then it takes over a year to actually form a government. So once you've done that, and this is something that when you invade a country, you can actually probably influence the way that the district system is working, the way political parties form. So you probably don't want to do what people did in Iraq, like say, let's have Kurds have their own parties, let's have Sunnites have their own parties, and Shiites. That's probably not going to integrate them or make them cooperate very much. So what you want to do is argue that it is possible, and that you're going to promote parties that are not on these primordial cleavages, as they're called. Then lastly, what you want to do, and then I'll get to your answers, one thing you really need to, 2 things you really need to make sure. One is, you need to make sure that you can argue that most of the anti-groups against your invasion are going to be gone. Like, you need to be able to argue that there's going to be few terrorists, and that they're not going to get much support from the general population. Preferably, therefore, you invade a country that doesn't really have mountains and stuff like that, or woods, forests, or anything that's good for guerrilla fighting.
Basically, invade the desert.
Well, Sudan, yeah, perfect example. Or the Netherlands, we don't have anything. We're just flat. We have like 2 mountains, well, hills. We call them mountains.
Sadly, already democratic.
Yeah. Yeah, it would be fun. Actually, America has, or the US has a Scheveningen Invasion Act, or the Hague Invasion Act, if there were ever going to be a military person from the US going to be tried in the ICJ or ICC, they're going to invade our country. So we could just try it.
I think go for it. It would be funny.
It would be fun, yeah. But besides that, what you need to do is make sure that there's enough hope in the country. So you need to make sure that there's economic progress, or at least people can see that there's a build-up after the war as well. This is also why you don't want the terrorists. Besides the obvious reasons why you don't want terrorists, there's also the harm they do economically, and to hope that there's going to be a better situation. If you can show that at least some of these things happen and the rest is controlled, you can still argue that it's possible. And what you then need to do is, there's lots of reasons why democracy is good, and why it's beneficial to us, and or why even if there's not going to be democracy, it's still not going to be as bad as it was right now. I think that's about it.
You said you should only promote the parties that are integrated.
Mm-hmm.
But on the other hand, earlier in the speech you said that the worst thing the EU has done was not promote, let's say, any religious party. But knowing religious parties, the Catholics won't form a party with Protestants. So
not true.
You have here that you never support the Catholic Party.
Yeah.
And then you have the exact problem you said was the worst thing the EU has done.
Okay, so just to give you a bit of a history on Dutch and German politics, the Catholic and I wanted to give you this because I think it's relevant. The Dutch society in general is very non-religious, so I don't think that's a very good example. But German society is slightly more religious, and what you have is a CDU and CSU, which is the Christian Democrat, and I don't know what the CSU stands for. But what you do have there is the Catholic and the Protestants working together in that one political party. And I don't know exactly how this works in Germany, but I know that in the Netherlands, we for a very long time had no cooperation whatsoever between Catholics and Protestants. Like when my parents grew up in the 1950s, as a Protestant, you should not and could not buy from a Catholic bakery. Or the other way around. You would not talk to people who were from the other religion. And you would definitely not marry someone from the other religion. So this is a very recent phenomenon, and it can work. And even though there was no trust whatsoever 50 years ago, there is trust now.
Right, but we're not talking about Germany that has... We're talking about countries that are obviously very divisive.
No, true. But Germany was less divisive than the Netherlands. The Netherlands was incredibly divisive. There was literally fighting in the streets. So this is obviously it's not the same, but it's as extreme in some ways as, say, Tunisia. Now moving back to Tunisia, there's already organizations that are politically interested, so you can't really influence the way the political parties are shaped. What you can do, however, is influence the way they cooperate. So if they define themselves as completely separate, distrustful of secularists, and almost anti-democratic, you've lost them. If you can integrate them into the democratic system, if you can show them that the other side is trustworthy, you can moderate them, sort of, and make sure that they're not as dangerous.
But you're not necessarily just going for the political party, you're going for its supporters who aren't necessarily as steadfast in their views.
Mm-hmm.
So while you might not think that the party might be lost on democratic process, if you pretend to integrate them, at least the people won't be as divisive.
Yeah, well, that as well. I think if the people see that you trust religion, because what you want to avoid is that it is seen as religion is bad, particularly in religiously conservative or at least religious society in general. You don't want to sort of show, you're all stupid, and let's talk about the real things. So you do need to have religion as an issue. It should not become the defining thing that excludes people. So as long as you have, say, the AK Party in Turkey, which is religious and it is divisive in certain ways, but it doesn't say we don't want Christians in our society, then that's the way you want to go. And the Christian parties in the Netherlands, and I think the same is true for other European parties, the Christian parties actually have lots of Muslims voting for them and lots of Muslims representing them. because they feel more comfortable with the Christian party than with, say, Labour. And they don't have a political clout to form their own party, so they sort of go for denominational parties, as we call them. So, like, slowly you can see a moderation happening. It just needs trust, which is something that you build over time. Any other questions? I think I actually managed in 1.5 hours.
Is there a paradoxical argument, like, that you can say, even if you're offering all the incentives of better trade agreements and joining the EU and all that, that people at the end of the day just willing to vote away their own democracy because they don't want it? Like, in terms of Moldova voting in communists and giving them enough power to change the constitution?
Yes. First of all, that's true. Yes, that could happen. It could still happen in most of these North African countries. You do have to argue that that's bad, that having had a democracy at some point, and then democratically chosen to give it away is worse than the current situation, I think. Which is easy. Like, you can argue that it is probably better to live in a society like Morocco, where there's limited freedom. Like, if you're really against the government, you're going to end up in jail. But most people have religious freedom. As long as you don't attack the government, you have plenty of freedom. And that's going to change if you get Sharia law. There's going to be less freedom because it's a more totalitarian regime versus a regime that's only interested in its own power. So yeah, you could, but you'd have to make sure to show that it's worse than what we have right now. Any other question? No? All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you.